Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today's question was suggested by a viewer, thanks to Drew Gross for this one. I'm also told by my colleagues Fightful AZ that this question belongs to the True Stories collection as well. Amy blitzes out a Girder Goons, and after she attacks with it and has it deal its combat damage to Nick, she plays a slip out the back targeting it. What happens? Specifically for this question, I'm going to be talking about two interactions that have to do with how blitz and phasing go together. I'm going to be talking about what happens with the ability that makes you sacrifice the blitzed creature at the end of turn, and the ability that lets you draw a card when the blitzed creature gets put into the graveyard. Ready? Let's get started. Now, the first thing that we're going to need to do is take a look at the comprehensive rules. I know that there's actually reminder text on this card, but here's the thing. Reminder text is meant to do exactly that. Remind the player how the ability works. It's not authoritative, and it actually has no effect on gameplay. The thing that we actually need in order to answer questions like these authoritatively would be the comprehensive rules text. Now, normally, especially on modern cards, there's a pretty close correspondence to what those two things say. However, Blitz is one of a handful of examples where there's actually a material difference between what the comprehensive rules and what the reminder text have to say about what the ability does. And so, we're definitely going to need to take a look at the comprehensive rules so that we know exactly how this happens. So, when we take a look in the comprehensive rules, we can see something very interesting, which is that Blitz does not give the creature an ability that says sacrifice this creature at end of turn. Rather, it uses something a little bit different to operate that. What it does is, anytime a spell resolves, there's going to be some effects that happen. And with a permanent spell, usually the only effect that you see is the permanent entering the battlefield. However, if you cast that permanent spell using Blitz, then there's also going to be another effect, which is to set up, somewhere in the game, a triggered ability that says, at the end of turn, you're going to sacrifice the permanent that's entering the battlefield, like this. So, what consequences does that have with our ruling? Well, let's notice that with phasing, as long as something is phased out, the game is basically going to treat it as though it doesn't exist. And so that means if there were a triggered ability on the blitzed permanent that said, at end of turn sacrifice me, well, that triggered ability would not trigger during the end of turn because the permanent that has that ability doesn't exist. On the other hand, if we have something like what the blitz text actually says, where there's a triggered ability that exists external to the creature out in the game somewhere, well, that would mean that at the end of turn, that triggered ability is still going to be triggering. And it's going to trigger and instruct Amy to sacrifice the creature. Of course, the game still considers that creature to not exist, which means that it's not going to be possible for Amy to sacrifice it, but you can see that there's a huge difference, in that the triggered ability actually did trigger and resolve, just like how it normally would. Now, there's one other kind of interesting fact that I want to draw everybody's attention to with the wording on that triggered ability specifically. Let's notice that with Blitz, it says that we sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. Now, here's the thing. That word next means that we're only referring to one specific end step, and after that time, that triggered ability has done its job. If, for some reason, we are not able to sacrifice that creature during that one specific end step, well, guess what? We're off the hook completely, and we aren't going to have to sacrifice that blitzed creature during the end of any other turns either, because we already had that triggered ability do its job during the one specific end step that the game set it up for. Let's contrast this wording with something like what we see on Ball Lightning. Now, with Ball Lightning, we can see that there's a couple of important differences that would affect how this situation played out. First of all, we'll of course notice that Ball Lightning itself has a triggered ability that says, at end of turn, sacrifice Ball Lightning. And so that means that the Ball Lightning would indeed not have any triggered abilities happen during the end of turn, because the thing that's supposed to have a triggered ability triggering then doesn't exist. And so that means that we're going to have the exact same outcome for this part, which is that we do not sacrifice during that first end step, the turn that we phased it out. However, it's for a completely different reason. The Blitz creature had a triggered ability happen, and then we just weren't able to sacrifice it during the resolution of that triggered ability, whereas the Ball Lightning didn't have that triggered ability happen at all, because it's printed on the Ball Lightning, which doesn't exist. Now, there's one other very important difference in between these two types of triggered abilities. Have you spotted it yet? Notice that, unlike the Blitz example, the Ball Lightning does not say that we're supposed to sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. It just says we're sacrificing it at the beginning of the end step. Every end step. There's not only one specific end step that the Ball Lightning's ability refers to. And so that means that even if we dodge the first bullet, we're still going to have that same triggered ability happen during every other end step until we actually do manage to sacrifice the Ball Lightning. And so that's another very important difference that's caused by a very small change in the templating. I wanted to draw all the templating nerds' attention to one extra special bonus point, which is that usually when we see triggered abilities that are on an actual permanent, like what we see with Ball Lightning, they tend to be templated that way, where they aren't going to apply to one specific end step, but rather to all of them. And that helps us to avoid awkward situations where a permanent that's supposed to get sacrificed actually ends up sticking around for a while. On the other hand, usually when you have triggered abilities that aren't physically written on a permanent, but exist out in the game somewhere, usually those tend to be worded something a little bit more like what we see with Blitz, where it only triggers at the beginning of one specific end step. This helps us to remember stuff because we don't have a triggered ability triggering over and over again, even though it's not associated with a text on any specific permanent. And so, as you can see here, we've got two very different examples, but they both look extremely similar at a first glance. Now that we've taken care of that, let's take a look at what's going to happen with the triggered ability that lets you draw a card when the blitzed creature dies. Is it going to work exactly the same way, or is there going to be some other subtle difference that's going to make the answer different? So with this, we can see that in the comprehensive rules, it defines this as the creature with Blitz gaining an ability that says, when this dies, draw a card. Now, that means that this is actually going to work a little bit differently. Because the creature with Blitz actually has the ability, when this dies, draw a card, that means that it is going to be a triggered ability on the thing that is a permanent. Now, to see why that's important, we're going to need a couple of other facts about how some game rules work. First of all, you might remember that if an object changes zones, it's generally going to mean that that object turns into a completely new object with no memory of its previous existence and no link to its past selves. However, an important fact about phasing is that it does not involve a zone change at all. Rather, it's just going to have its status change from phased out to phased in, or vice versa. And so, because we are not changing zones, that rule that makes it a new object with no connection to its previous identity does not apply. And, in turn, what that means is that if you have a creature that was blitzed and it phases out and phases back in again, the game still is able to identify that that creature was cast using its blitz cost. And so therefore, the blitz ability is still going to be giving it haste and when this dies, draw a card. Even though the game doesn't have a full record of that permanent's existence, and it lost track of it for a little bit, it still is able to trace its existence back to the point where it was cast, and that means that it does still get the ability when this dies, draw a card. Obviously the part where it gains haste isn't super relevant, but the other one certainly is. It means that if this creature was to die this turn, the turn it phased in, or some later turn, 10 turns down the road even, it still is going to cause its controller to draw a card. Pretty cool trick, Amy. And that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling, but until then, I hope you have a great day.